All right, welcome to this episode of Crime Inc. Every episode, we will take a look at an aspect of the criminal justice system through the eyes of our guest. My name is Alexander Benikov, and I'll be your host. I'm a defense lawyer, author, adjunct law professor, and I've always been interested in the world of crime and punishment. Really excited about our guest today. Our guest today is mentor and a friend of mine. He's a defense lawyer. He's also spent a large part of his career at the public defender's office, and we actually met when I was interning for him at the public defender's office, and this was 2008ish, somewhere around there.
About that time.
Yeah. A while ago. So he was a really good teacher and a really good lawyer. He was one of the first really high level defense lawyers that I got to meet, and hopefully I learned a little bit from him along the way. So I wanted to have him on to talk about the role of the public defender. Obviously, a lot of issues surrounding that. So welcome, Mr. Brown.
Hello.
Yeah. Thank you. So I just wanted to give a little bit of background on the role of the public defender. Lauren, I'm sure you know this, but so we have about 5% of the world's population and about 25% of the global prison population. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that Department of Justice estimates that between 60 and 90% of the criminal defendants can't afford to retain private counsel. So that means their case goes to public defenders. And then in 2007, approximately 5.5 million cases were handled by public defenders' offices. So it kind of gives you a scope of the job and the cases of the system. So, Lauren, first, what brought you to law school in the first place?
Well, my stepfather was a lawyer, and still is, as a matter of fact. And he had a way of sort of ferreting the truth out of us. He had a cross-examination style, and I kind of adopted whenever I dealt with people. And people always told me, you know what, you should be a lawyer. And so med school didn't look like it was going to work out for me. Yeah. So law school seemed like the thing.
Yeah, I had a similar experience myself, where law school seemed like too much math. Were you always interested in criminal defense, or how did you fall or step into that?
Well, I have to admit, when I first started law school, I knew that I wanted to be an attorney, of course, and I knew I didn't want to work for a large firm. That didn't appeal to me. The idea of working in some dusty room and briefing and reading reams and reams of paper and never really being in the court, that didn't appeal to me. So I didn't know exactly. It wasn't until I took a seminar in criminal defense while at law school that I realized, well, okay, this is something I could do, something I like.
Was that pretty early on, or do you remember?
It was probably sometime in the middle of my second year in law school.
Okay. How did you get to the public defender's office?
Well, luckily for me, I also interned at the public defender's office in Washington County under Lloyd Powell and Mr. Hugo Mack. And during my time there, when I interned, Hugo was awesome. He did about 3 trials while I was there. He got not guilties on all of them. His cross-examination was excellent. I mean, it was just fascinating. And so when I graduated, I started working in Detroit, and I had come to Ann Arbor to file some papers for the attorney firm where I was working. And I ran into Hugo, and he told me just coincidentally that they had an opening and that I should apply. And I guess fate was in my corner, and it was just decided I should be a public defender because I applied, and they remembered I had interned there. Hugo put in a good word for me, and there I was. That was back in 1991.
Okay. And you mentioned Mr. Powell. He was actually still there when I was interning in 2008. Can you give a little bit about his background, because he's a pretty interesting guy?
Yeah, Mr. Powell is a very fascinating guy. He was born in 1936, still very much a segregated America. But fascinatingly enough, he was able to get into an Army officers program, even though he was a black man. And that really shaped his view the Army is probably, at least then, it was a segregated Army, but it was one of the places where an African American male could get ahead and could, rise up in the ranks. Well, so he started out in the military. He worked there as an officer. He made it up to the rank of major. He was a military policeman. And he got out and he went to law school after that. He worked as a prosecutor for a few years. He worked with the public defender's office and then went back to the prosecutor's office. And when the opening came up in Ann Arbor, he applied and he became the public defender there.
And for younger listeners, it's pretty hard to explain what the racial tone was, right, in the 50s and 60s for a black lawyer.
Well, it was tough. There's a movie coming out about the Thurgood Marshall. I recommend that all of your young attorneys go and check that out. Because it'll give a lot of insight as to what that was like. But it was tough. It was a segregated era, and it was very tough for even an educated, early black man to be able to get ahead.
When you started at the PD, as you said, it was early 90s?
Yes, 1991.
What kind of cases did you start out handling?
Well, I was fortunate in that I started out, and the office was set up differently then. You pretty much had the opportunity to handle some of everything: misdemeanors, juvenile, and even felonies. So I was on the fast track. When I got in, probably within months after I got started, I had an armed robbery trial that I was working on, as well as a CSC trial. And so my experiences with the public defender's office was I was in there quickly. I was handling tough cases very quickly to capital cases, capital offenses.
How soon would you say you had your first capital case after starting?
Probably within 6 months, I had a CSC case.
Oh, wow. Can you explain what that is to people that don't know?
Okay, CSC is what's commonly known as a rape case, criminal sexual conduct.
Okay.
And those are very serious offenses, of course. And I was defense counsel on one of those. It was pretty challenging, I have to say.
Do you remember what you were thinking? Was it like, what am I doing here? I don't know what I'm doing, or do you
exactly that?
Yeah.
Exactly that. Because there was a lot of responsibility in my in very young hands. Mm-hmm. I had a person who was charged with this offense, and my concern was, would I do a good job for him? Would I be able to protect him from the power of the state crushing him? The allegations were serious, and in that sort of situation, the desire to make sure that those accused somehow pays the cost tends to be kind of high. And you have to be able to stand against the state's power in brushing aside this person and putting them into the system. So, and it was a lot of responsibility, and I felt it.
Yeah. Going back to race for a second, so you started practicing early 90s. Obviously, things were different than when Mr. Powell started practicing in the 50s or 60s. But did you still see African-American lawyers being treated differently? Or and obviously Ann Arbor, isn't a typical small town. It's obviously
right.
University town. But what was your experience like?
Well, my experience was when I graduated from law school, I went to Detroit. Detroit at the time was what we called a chocolate city. There were a lot of African Americans there, and the judges. There were a lot of judges who were African American. There were still traces and issues that had to be dealt with. But I was fortunate in that I was either in Detroit or in Ann Arbor. And as you pointed out, Ann Arbor was somewhat atypical. It wasn't like practicing, say, in southern Indiana or southern Georgia somewhere, where people wore their biases on their sleeves. So if there were biases, they were much more subtle.
So it was. Can you explain that a little bit more? That it's not people calling you names to your face, but just little things that you pick up on.
No, there were little things like microaggressions. One of the things that I was always told as a young attorney is I had to make sure that my expressions and my reactions weren't too big, they weren't too aggressive, and they weren't too loud, because that's what people thought that black attorneys were. They were loud, aggressive, pushy. And I managed to keep a lot of the aggression. But, and also, even in the way I dress, it talked about, you had to dress in muted colors, black or bright colors. And so there were all these stereotypes and all these things that I had to deal with and overcome in order to be able to relate to my juries, I felt.
Mm-hmm. And that's so interesting because, me being a white lawyer, obviously nobody had conversations like that with me. So that's fascinating that, even in the 90s, which wasn't that long ago, that, you were still told that, to do these things, which is scary and fascinating.
Right. Yeah. Oh, yeah. But, that was, to me, that was just the way the world was at the time.
Right.
And sure, you felt it. You wondered why, you would be singled out for these sorts of things. But, that was my life growing up. I always felt that I had to be somewhat muted in dealing with people because they would take my addressing them in a certain way much more differently than they would take someone else addressing them a certain way. I would always be seen as more aggressive and more scared. And so that's a fact of life. That's something that I grew up going to school in Ann Arbor and being a lawyer, that, you have to sort of temper the way you appear being a black attorney or a black man. But again, that was a fact of life. So it was pretty much more of the same that I had grown up with.
And unfortunately, a lot of those issues are still with us, right? Because you look at sports, Colin Kaepernick takes a knee, it's a national outrage. I'm sure if somebody like Peyton Manning would have done it, we'd probably be having a very different conversation.
Well, certainly. Remember, Tim Tebow took a knee because he said he couldn't support a flag that allowed abortion.
That's right.
Not a word was there.
No.
Not a word, not the kind of thing that you get now.
Right.
So definitely, it's been true, since forever in this country, and it's still true that black African Americans doing certain things are always going to be seen as different and accepted as differently than others doing those same things. It's one of the stigma that we wear as black people.
Right. And what's really fascinating and scary is that a lot of people don't realize that, right? Or they say, no, that's not really a thing.
Right, exactly right.
Yeah, and again, a little bit outside the law context, but, me being a white male, I don't see a lot of these things. I have a friend who's from Mexico, and, he tells me how different he's treated in Phoenix because, everybody assumes that he's a legal immigrant, which he's not, and that he's unemployed, and that he's not. And, he gets a lot of things that, that I would never get. So it's, really interesting, hearing people's experiences because obviously they're very different.
And you think to the south of you when Sheriff Arpaio was there.
Right.
That is policy.
Right.
It's policy treating people that way.
Yeah. It's I'm optimistic that things are slowly getting better, but I'm always amazed, when somebody says, no, we're fine, everything's been solved.
There are some people who truly want to believe that.
Yeah.
And it'd be nice if their, delusions could become our reality.
Absolutely.
But it's not yet the case.
Absolutely. So you started the PD's early 90s, right?
Yes.
So what are some of the different titles or roles that you've had there?
Well, I started out as an assistant public defender, and initially, the way our office was set up, you bounced around. You did just about every day. You could be doing something different. You could be working in juvenile court. You could be doing misdemeanors. You could just be doing arraignments. And they streamlined the process in Washtenaw County, where now everyone, at least in the public defender's office, has a certain role, at least a primary role they serve. So now primarily I do what are known as preliminary examinations. And those are simply that initial hearing that one has when one is accused of a felony. The prosecution is supposed to show that there's enough evidence that the case should move forward. The purpose of preliminary examinations is to sort of weed out unnecessary and unsupported charges. And so my job primarily because I still do all of those other things, misdemeanors, juvenile. But primarily, my job is to serve at preliminary examinations and hold sort of these mini trials when my clients want them to see if the prosecution has shown that their case is sufficient to move forward.
And you still have a mentoring, teaching role?
Absolutely. We have a very robust internship program, one that I'm in charge of, or co-in charge of. Mr. Tim Neiman, my colleague, who's been there almost as long as I have consistently, is also one of the persons who's in charge of our internship program. And so what we do is we take law students, undergrad students, and sometimes even high school students, and they come into our office, and we train them on legal work. The law students pretty much do everything that we can do as far as representing clients, doing interviews, negotiating with prosecutors, even getting on the record, which is important. That's very big. Being able to put their appearance on the record and represent an actual living, breathing client, to sort of demystify that whole process. That when they do become practicing attorneys, they've gone through that experience, and it's not fearful or frightful for them.
And I can tell you it's an invaluable experience, because when I started my own practice, I had that experience of, that I've done, a couple of prelims, or, I've been to the jail, and, I got to talk to people because, as traditionally law schools haven't always been the best at that. So, for a student to be able to go in and, talk to an actual, inmate or defendant, I remember with you, we spent, countless hours, at the jail talking to people, going over police reports. I got to appear in front of, more judges than I can remember. So not shifting, but continuing as far as the PD role, what's usually surprises students or law students the most about the PD's role? Because I'm assuming there's a lot of misconceptions.
Well, they're surprised at how hard we work for our clients. Of course, the television perception of public defenders is, we're all, I don't know if you're familiar with Scrubs. You remember the attorney there on Scrubs? I forget what his name was.
Vaguely.
Yeah, he would flop sweat whenever any issue came up. He was scared and nervous. He was the kind of guy always shaking and dropping his files and stuttering on them. Well, I expect that a lot of students expect that us public defenders will be like that. They're surprised at just how well trained and how able we are to handle these cases, and just how, modestly speaking, of course, how good some of my colleagues are when they get out there and they handle these things. That's because that's what we do.
Yeah, and I always try to explain that to students or clients that you get better through anything through repetition, right? So once you've done a couple hundred trials, you're probably going to know how to do trials. You hire some criminal defense attorney who claims to be a criminal defense attorney who hasn't done a trial in 18 years. It's different. So with students and law students, what makes a good public defender? And again, for the viewers, backing up a little bit, your office is kind of unique because, first of all, it's very small. And second of all, a lot of people spend most of their careers there, right? Which is kind of unusual for a lot of PD's offices.
Exactly right. So we'll address that part first. We have these group photos we take every 10 years. I don't know if you remember seeing those, Alex.
I do.
So every 10 years we take these photos, and one of the things that most strikes people who look at them is how little those photos change over the years. You've got probably maybe 40 years worth of photos there, and from photo to photo, there, some faces will be added, some are gone, but for the most part, it maintains and stays the same. We're lucky in that Washtenaw County committed very early to public defense. They committed resources, they committed workspace, and training. And because they've done that, we have very well-paid attorneys. We have some of the highest salaries in the country. We're certainly competitive to the area we live in. We have some of the best training in the country and some of the best resources as far as workspace and all of that. You haven't been to see us recently, Alex, but we've moved from where we were. Now we're in a high-rise building across the street and around the corner from where we were. And it's very, very wonderful space. So all of these things contribute to maintaining consistency and having attorneys who stay once they get there. So our turnover rate is probably much, much lower than maybe any other public defender's office that you can think of in the country.
And you guys have about a dozen lawyers, somewhere around there?
Yeah, about 14.
Okay.
14 attorneys.
And
they handle.
I'm sorry.
They handle different areas. We have some who are dedicated to abuse, neglect, and juvenile delinquency, and that's something that's also unusual with our public defender's office. You don't have most public defender's office that will handle abuse and neglect cases in the juvenile system. We also will do friend of the court sorts of cases and personal protection orders. Those are the kinds of things that many public defenders will leave to private firms and such.
And, you know, to give the listeners a sense of scale or just comparison, Maricopa County Public Defender's Office here in Phoenix, I think they have about 350 lawyers. So it's pretty different. And the public defender's office here, I mean, there's definitely some people that spend their careers there, but generally, you know, people spend 2 or 3 years and then they try to get out. And you talked about income. That's obviously a huge issue for public defenders, right? Because if you're making, you know, you may not be getting rich, but, you know, you're making a comfortable living. You know, that's one thing. I've got a prosecutor friend in a different town in Michigan, and he's making probably $30,000 less than a comparable prosecutor here in Phoenix. So, you know, that's obviously going to affect, you know, his career choices down the road. So it was a conscious decision by the county or whoever's in charge to get good people to stay.
Yes, and there were a lot of things that went into it. But probably the best thing that happened is our public defender's office unionized, and we got parity with the prosecutors, which means whenever they got a raise, we got a raise, and vice versa. Whenever we got a raise in our negotiations with the county, they got a raise. And so those were the sorts of things that allowed us to maintain high salaries and maintain a consistent work group.
And you alluded to as far as how PDs are seen, and, you know, we've all seen this, you know, clients saying you're a public pretender, I want a real lawyer, right? All of that's out there. Has that something that's always been out there, or has that changed in your career?
Yes, I mean, yeah, that's something that's going to be pretty common. Part of it is, you know, media portrayal. Like I said, I go back to the attorney that you see on the script. He's not a public defender, but that's generally how they portray public defenders. It's overworked. Kind of a stumbling idiot that's dropping files and late to court. Right, and so we're fighting against that sort of notion. Plus, you add on to the fact that they don't pay for us, and people tend to value more when they actually pay for out of their pockets. Absolutely. So they're only worth what I paid for, which is nothing. Right. This is until we actually start working for them. Right. And I get this so many times. I can't believe that you're a public defender. Right. And, you know, and that's from the initial thing. It's you lousy public pretender. You know, you're gonna go have coffee with them. Right. Yeah, and for our listeners, they may be able to tell, but Mr. Brown, what I would call, has a presence. So when he's talking to clients, you know, they're thinking, you know, he's going to be stumbling and not knowing what he's doing, and you know that's not the impression that you get. Yeah, public defenders and defense lawyers in general, right? Generally in movies, we're skeezy, we're underhanded, we're cutting corners, we're, you know, shifty. You know, everything from The Simpsons to The Wire to The Sopranos. You know, basically every show you can think of. You know, it's pretty rare that the defense lawyer is portrayed as saying, no, we're going to do the ethical thing. Right. And that's the last great public defender portrayal, I think, was in Hill Street Blues. Yeah. Where they had a female public defender, who was just awesome. And that was what, early 90s? Oh, that was like... before? 80s. Yeah, so... Yeah.
So a while ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I do in my own practice. I do some court-appointed stuff, and then I'm in private practice also. And I get treated very differently by my private clients because, as you said, when you've paid a lot of money, and generally for my clients it is a lot of money. They treat you differently. I've always equated it, the analogy of playing with house money. You go to a casino, somebody gives you a bunch of chips. You don't really care if you lose them. You come in with your own money, your outlook's going to be different. So you haven't seen much of a change as far as it getting better or worse, how clients see public defenders?
Well, yeah, I'd say that's fairly consistent. It won't change until, the overall perception of defense counsel, appointed defense counsel changes. And, usually what drives that is media portrayals. Also anything else, because not everybody spends every day dealing with appointed counsel. They only know from what they see in the media portrayals. As long as those portray us in a certain way, then we'll be that until the fortunate or unfortunate few will have to use our services, realize, hey, these guys are pretty good.
And it's not just media portrayal of public defenders, it's of everything, right? So I have countless, defendants on misdemeanor cases that say, when do we get the DNA back? And,
right.
and I look at them, I'm like, there's no DNA coming.
That's exactly right. Yeah, I don't think CSI is the whole lot.
Yeah. But yeah, so that obviously plays a role. So when you're representing somebody, how do you get them to see you as a real defense lawyer and not, in their head, just a public defender?
Well, one of the first things that I think is most important to our clients is that they have to feel like they're heard, like you hear what it is they're saying. Even the ones who know pretty much the jig is up, they pretty much got me. They want to feel like you've heard what they said, and that you are going to help them in whatever way you can. If it's a case where they feel they're not guilty, they want to feel that you're going to fight for them. If it's a case where they kind of know their call and they just want to mitigate the damages, they want to feel like you're going to do that, like you're going to go in there and try to reduce the cost to them of having been charged. So I guess what it distills down to is the client wants to know that you're going to work for them, no matter what it is they want you to do. They want to feel like you're going to put in the time and the effort and that you care enough to work for them.
That makes sense. Do you feel it's easier or harder to be a PD now than when you started, or about the same?
Well, it's easier in some aspects because, I've seen a lot.
Yeah.
And nothing's scary to me anymore.
Right.
I'm not concerned about, this new judge, how's he going to react. Because I've been there, I've been around the block a few times, and I have the confidence to know that, the arguments I'm going to make are going to be effective. They're going to be heard. Now, whether Judge grants one, I'll get into that. I don't know. Same thing with the facts. I'm not afraid of going against the prosecutor. So it's easier for me, for one, in my experience, because of my experience. But let's say, more generally speaking, someone who is just coming in to be a public defender. Well, given the climate that we have, and it's interesting because there's a division that's going on out there. There's some people who are going to support the police no matter what. No matter what, they're the police, we got to support them. There are now people who are beginning to question their motivations, to question why they're doing things. I don't know yet how that's going to play out, but it's interesting. It's interesting to see how these times affect our jurors. Are they going to be more willing to listen to a client who says, no, the police officer is not telling the truth about how these things happen. This is how things really happen. Or are they going to be rejecting that? No, we got to back our police whatsoever. No matter what, we got to back them up. So I think your question is yet to be determined given the way our times are shaping.
And on the police side, it's interesting too, because I think a lot of it has to do with where you are. So I had one of my mentors here in Phoenix. He was a capital attorney at the PD's office in LA. And he was saying that, there you could put an officer on the stand and call him a liar, and the jury would say, yeah, probably. In Phoenix, which is a lot more conservative, we're solidly a red state, can't do that. I put an officer on the stand, I call him a liar, jury's not going to be too happy with me. So I think that's also a variable. We were talking a little of this before we started recording, but one of the big changes is what we have as far as video that's available to us, right?
Right, absolutely. That's changed the game quite a bit. Now everyone has a walking camera studio with them. So we see so much and we know so much more about how things operate, how things unfold and as they unfold. And juries now maybe can be a little bit more skeptical. And certainly they can see the video evidence, and in some cases they can accept it. And in some cases, they can reject it. But it's a different world in that now we no longer have to rely on just an eyewitness giving his or her version of events. Not so much.
Yeah, and Phoenix, a lot of the police departments have body cameras now. Are there more? Is that going on more in Michigan?
We just did some training on that, interesting enough. One of the things we do is we try to have training every month in the public defender's office. And just this past week, we had one of the officers from the Ann Arbor Police Department come in and explain how their body cams work and how they're going to go forward to using those safeguards they have in place to keep them from being accidentally, and you're missing my air quotes here, accidentally being turned off.
Yeah, whoops.
How they go with other cameras in the area, other body cams.
Speaking of accidentally, I don't know if you caught in the news a couple of months ago, it was a police department somewhere in the South, I don't remember where, they had dash cams in their cars, but the police officers would open their hoods to block the cameras.
Right.
And they were like, the cars were overheating, and I think it was like winter and it wasn't hot at all.
Right.
Yeah.
In cases like that, you would think most juries would be automatically skeptical. But,
Right.
like you said, depending on whether it's a red or a blue state.
Right.
And that's perfectly fine.
Yeah, as far as your defendants, I want to talk about drugs a little bit. We obviously had the war on drugs, and we still do. Was that already in place when you started practicing?
Oh, yes. Ronald Reagan was already in the White House, and he had started his Just Say No campaign, his war on drugs. In fact, Ronald, in 91, that's a sign that you're getting old.
Yeah.
I think maybe George Bush might have been in by this time. But the war on drugs is still a thing, most definitely. And, we still had the effects of the crack cocaine epidemic and all of the stuff that was sort of ancillary to that. We had high incidents of boosting, and that's what organized shoplifting was, so they could sell things to get money for crack cocaine. There was so much more crack house and maintaining crack house cases, and so much more violence associated with crack cocaine, even carjackings. When I first came in, carjackings were a big thing because people were stealing the cars and trying to sell them or turn them over to get crack cocaine. So it was, when I first got in, it was very, very, wild.
Right. And I'm assuming the federal policies had an effect on local prosecutors and sentencing guidelines.
Absolutely. The guidelines were very draconian. They were very harsh. People were being sent away for 20 years for having rocks. And more often than not, it was cases where the police officers were setting up regular users by, giving them cocaine to have them delivered to someone else. So they would end up getting higher charges. Also, there were the forfeitures statutes, which were a big deal at the time. They still are, to a certain extent, although they haven't subsided. But when I first came in, they were very anxious to be able to seize all of these monies and all the property they could. So they had, each jurisdiction had some sort of drug interdiction unit set up, and our break was called LawNet. And one of the things they did was they wanted to go in, if they found a rock or crack anywhere on a person, they wanted to seize every asset they had, including, they found it in the car, they want to seize the car. They found it next to someone's wallet with their just cash paycheck money, all the money was seized, so on and so forth.
Are you starting to see a change now at all as far as sentencing with drug crimes?
Oh, yes. In fact, the change started probably in the mid-90s, where there was an outcry against the draconian sentencing. So the sentencing, it's put more of it in the discretion of the judges. The kinds of drugs used now have also changed. We're seeing less crack cocaine. We're seeing much more heroin, much more meth. And oddly enough, they have different sort of clientele. We're seeing more meth in the rural areas. That people are cooking up meth.
Right.
And we're still seeing cocaine in the urban areas. We're seeing heroin. And for a while, though, we're seeing a rise in LSD. That has made a comeback for a bit.
So, interesting. So obviously all clients are different, and no two cases are the same, but I'm sure in your many years, what kind of patterns do you see as far as who your clients are, as far as socioeconomic background?
Well, and part of that being that we're in Ann Arbor, we do see a wide mix.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sort of break down. We see much more of the crack cocaine in the urban areas. And we have more drunk driving cases in the sort of rural areas. We have more of the larcenies. Those take place also more urban areas. Our clientele breaks down. We do have a large number of African Americans who are our clientele, but a surprisingly large number of majority individuals as well. In fact, I would say that it breaks down almost somewhat evenly.
Okay. How does someone's financial background play into their case? You know what I mean? As far as, if you're poor, do you get the same justice as somebody with money?
Absolutely not. One of the things we see with the prosecutors are, unfortunately, is sometimes we'll have, let's say we have an African-American college student who's done a shoplifting or licensing building. We have a white college student who's done the same. They're still more likely to allow some sort of diversion for the white student. More often than not, if they do make an offer to the black student, it'll be for multiple misdemeanors, somebody so that they cannot take them off their record.
Right. And is that hopefully getting better or staying the same, over the past 10, 15, 20 years?
It's probably been somewhat consistent.
Okay. I'm assuming that also comes into play as far as sentencings.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All of that. Because once you get them started on a track, or anyone started on a track, they tend to progress down the road. So the 18-year-old black male now has 2 misdemeanors on his record. If he picks up anything else, now there's not going to be any offers because he has these 2 priors.
Right.
And so maybe next time he gets a felony. The white kid, he doesn't have anything on his record because he got a diversion. So now he gets 1 misdemeanor. All right, so let's say they're unfortunate enough to get involved in something another time. So now the black kid, because he's got the misdemeanors, he's got the felony, he's headed to prison. The white kid, who now has a single misdemeanor on his record, he may still be considered for diversion. He certainly will be more probation eligible. His guideline numbers will be lower because they tracked him early, and that's the result of that tracking.
Yeah, and also I mentioned sentencing, but it plays into charging also, right? As far as what kind of crimes people get charged with.
Absolutely. Let's take domestic violence, for example. They're often more likely to be charged with strangulation. That was something they've added to domestic violence. They've added a strangulation aspect of it. I don't know if maybe it's, and also if these officers have been trained to sort of bring this out. In domestic violence cases, we'll always see part of the recitation is that, well, he was yelling at me or whatever, he grabbed me by my neck and he choked me until I couldn't breathe. And so once the police officers elicit that, they'll add a 10-year felony to the charges, where once it was just a first-time domestic violence, which was going to be a misdemeanor, now they're able to push that up to a 10-year felony. Unsurprisingly, you do find that charge a lot more often in the black male cases of domestic violence.
And that has an insane effect on somebody's life, right? Because it could change from them looking at a misdemeanor to them looking at prison.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So if you're talking to a young lawyer and they say, I'm thinking about joining a public defender's office, and let's just say a generic public defender's office. I think yours is one of the elite ones, but you don't know where it is, you don't know anything about it. What should they know? They come to you and say, "Hey, thinking about taking this job, public defender's office. I'm out of law school. What?"
What they should know is that it's going to be a lot of work. It's going to be an opportunity to hone your skills. It's going to be an opportunity to get a lot of opportunity, a lot of chances to be before a judge, to develop your ability to be able to change and relate to different judges, change and deal with different prosecutors. Take advantage of that opportunity, because there's going to be a lot thrown at you. And if you decide to leave public defense, God forbid, you'll be ready and able to do anything. But if you decide to stay, you'll have honed your skills such that you'll be at home and able to handle anything that's thrown at you if you take the opportunity and a chance to learn.
And I don't know the numbers, but we can probably agree most lawyers don't stay at the public defender's office their whole career, right?
Yeah, outside of our office, no.
Yeah.
We don't hear them staying there. And I've had a lot of interns who keep in touch and tell me what they're doing. A lot of them will go to public defender's office. They don't generally stay there longer than 2 or 3 years.
Right.
They're off to hang up their own shingles or going to work with some firm.
Right. So kind of follow up to that, somebody has an offer from the prosecutor's office and the public defender's office. They're not sure. They've kind of heard a lot of the general, prosecutors are the good guys. They fight crime. Defense lawyers are the bad guys. We get people off. Somebody comes to you and they're kind of 50-50, which is kind of unusual. But for argument's sake, let's say they really don't know where they should go work, and they're trying to decide. What do you tell them?
I remind them that criminal defense are the true law enforcement officers. We're enforcing the Constitution. All of those rights where people are given the right to counsel, the right to remain silent, the right to be free from unlawful illegal searches. Those are the kinds of things that we're enforcing. What we're enforcing is the law for every single individual who comes before us, making sure, which always guilt or innocence isn't really our final say. This is truly our final purview. What is our purview is to make sure that every person who represents, who we stand beside, who comes before the court, has the best possible representation, and they make the prosecution do the work to prove their case.
And
that's it.
Yeah, and as we know, it's you're obviously defending your client, but as you mentioned, you're also you're also protecting everyone's rights, right?
Right, and the bigger picture is that with each individual client, we are protecting everyone's rights to be free from unlawful searches and seizures.
Yeah, one thing that I heard when I was new that I always liked is that with police officers, you want them thinking in the back of the head, I'm going to be on the stand one day, and this annoying defense lawyer. It may have actually been from you. I don't remember. So that's important, right? Because I grew up in the former USSR, where I don't think we had defense lawyers, and if we did, I'm sure they couldn't do anything. So the police pull you over. You're not worried about your appellate rights. You're worried about not ending up in a work camp.
Right, exactly right. That's a true statement. The biggest compliment I had was when unwittingly given to me by an officer. I remember we were about to have a hearing of some sort. It was a hearing we were going to access an evidentiary hearing. And I had dealt with the officer before in the stand. And I remember I was walking by and he had just come in. He was talking to the prosecutor. And they had some conversation, and the officer, after the conversation, looks over and he says, points over to me and says, "It's going to be the defense attorney. We should make a deal. Make a deal."
That's a pretty proud day for a defense lawyer, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that is the best compliment I could have, is that the prosecutor, the police officer realized that, it wasn't going to be easy. He wasn't just going to be able to get up on the stand and say whatever he wanted, and have that just be believed because he had a badge.
Right. And a lot of our clients can't really defend themselves, right? Maybe it's lack of education, maybe it's mental health issues, maybe it's, a million other things that I think a lot of people don't think about. I think it was either you or someone else, told me that we're kind of the last line of defense, that a lot of these people, can't represent themselves. So, just a couple more questions. You've been very gracious with your time. So, when you talk to people, and I talk to people, and they say, "I'm law-abiding, I'm not going to go to prison. Why should I care about public defender funding? Why should I care about the quality representation that I get?" What do you say?
I say that the truth is, we really can't guarantee that we won't be falsely accused. We can't, none of us, we can certainly guarantee our actions, but we can't guarantee the actions of others. We can't guarantee the perception of others. We can't guarantee that someone won't mistakenly believe that we've done something to break the law, that we don't look like that guy who they saw breaking into a house. So sure, you can certainly guarantee that you yourself won't decide to do anything wrong, but you can't guarantee that you won't be accused or wrongfully accused. That's something that's beyond your power. And if that day never comes, you really want to have the best possible system to defend you. If you can't afford it, you certainly want to be sure that you'll be appointed someone who's competent and capable.
Mm.
So,
and people don't want to think about this, but there's innocent people in prison right now, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And we know through the Innocence Project, through DNA testing, they've cleared some 300, probably even more now, inmates from serious offenses. And you know this better than I do. There's a very sad and long history of black defendants in the South and other places being accused, by white people that, he did this, and there's no evidence, but it's there's a lot of famous, defense lawyers, that had these insane cases where there's no evidence. Like, well, we just wanted to, we err on the side of caution and convict the young black defendant.
Yeah, that's right. You don't have to look any further than Chicago. I mean, not too long ago, there was the young lad case.
Yeah.
It was falsifying just thousands of reports because she wanted to be liked and wanted to be accepted by the prosecutors and the police officers. Mm-hmm. And that's a real thing.
Yeah, we had a detective here a couple of years ago who got caught planting evidence. And like you were saying, people don't think it can happen, but unfortunately it does.
Oh yeah, in Baltimore, the officers were caught 2 times in a row planting cocaine and accidentally had their cameras.
Yeah, they probably need to work on their mastermind planting evidence skills.
Yeah, they don't want them to go to any classes for that.
Yeah,
they want them to get better, but hey.
Yeah. Hey, last question for you. It's a classic defense lawyer question. People ask, how can you defend these people? A lot of the time, they're guilty. A lot of the time, or some of the time, they're not good people. They've done horrible things. There's all these horrible, sex offender cases. Cases involving kids. All these, horrible, unspeakable crimes. So how do you? I always like asking defense lawyers that. What's your approach, or what's your answer?
Well, my answer is this. It's easy to look at the crime that's being charged and say, that's terrible. I don't want to have anything to do with that. But that's it. That's the true heart of it. What we're doing as attorneys, whether we're appointed or private, is we're making sure the system works the way it's supposed to work. The framers of the Constitution and those who wrote those first 10 amendments put a lot of thought into those things. They wanted a system that didn't allow people to be run over by the power of the government. They wanted a system where the individual had the right to be able to fight against the government. The government decided to come after them and take their property, their life, and their liberty. And what we're doing is we're making sure that the power of the government and the heinousness, the fearfulness of the charges don't overcome the system. The system is really a wonderful one. It's a great system that allows anyone who's accused to be able to face their accusers, forces the prosecution to prove their case, to weigh the evidence they have, or a jury, or whoever's listening. They have to weigh the prosecution's evidence. People don't realize, it's never the defendant who's on trial. It's the prosecution's evidence that's on trial. That's really what's on trial. Because the person who accused is supposed to be considered innocent until proven guilty. What a jury does, they're supposed to be listening to the evidence of the prosecution presents, deciding, is that enough? Is that enough to make me decide this person is not innocent but guilty? And that's my job. My job is to make whoever hears that case take that job seriously, to make the prosecution take their job seriously. Don't cut corners because it's a scary case, because a person's charged with murder or child molestation. And every time they step up to say, I'm going to take your freedom or even your life, they do the process the way it's supposed to be done. And so that's what we're supposed to be doing. And that's how I can defend those people, because I'm defending not just the people, but the entire system every time I take a case.
That's probably a good place to end. That's a wonderful answer. Hey, Mr. Brown, thank you so much on a personal level for everything that you taught me, because I know it's helped out a lot. And thank you for your time. I really enjoyed it.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
All right. You're welcome.
Bye.